So welcome everyone to today's ME SUD Learning Community webinar. Today we'll be hearing from Randy Morrison on a brief introduction to integrating peer support roles into multidisciplinary teams. My name is Kristen with CCSME. I'll be supporting today's webinar, filling in for Bethany today. We have just a few quick notes before we begin. First, neither the presenters nor the program planners have any relevant financial relationships to disclose. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of ACCME through the joint providership of the Hanley Center for Health Leadership and Education and CCSME. The Hanley Center is accredited by the MMA Committee on Continuing Medical Education and Accreditation to provide CME for physicians. The Hanley Center has designated this activity for one AMA PRA Category 1 credit. The opinions expressed by the speakers in this webinar series are their own and do not represent the position of CCSME or the state of Maine. Recording and live stream transmission of this webinar without consent is not permitted. We will have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers, so please hold any questions until that time. You can also put them in the chat as we go, and we'll circle back to them at the end. And now I'd like to give a quick introduction to our speaker for today. Randy Morrison is a person who personally understands the challenges of navigating substance use and mental health concerns. He is a certified international peer support specialist, IPS trainer, and CCAR recovery coach trainer, and he has a master's in public health and a master's in policy, planning, and management. Randy spent over 7 years leading the growth and implementation of peer support programs across Maine's largest healthcare system before becoming a full-time trainer and consultant. And with that, I will hand it off to Randy for our presentation. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Kristen. It's been a minute since I've heard someone read that bio, so it's always feels weird. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk, as Kristen mentioned, about sort of integrating peer support roles, primarily through like a substance use lens. But this is really applicable across many peer support roles and trainings. And Kristen did introduce me. So as you heard, I've been in the peer support world for many years. I practiced peer support in the shelters of Portland and then moved into more of a leadership role where I was supporting program implementation, where I got a lot of the experience that I'm going to share today about structuring peer support roles with fidelity. And so I'm just going to walk through and do like a brief kind of grounding in sort of peer support philosophy or practices and training, and then go into sort of those integration pieces. We called this a brief introduction. It probably would have been more apt to call it a speed introduction because I'm going to try to cover as much as possible. So if you do have questions, just like write those down, and I'll definitely have a chunk of time at the end for those. If something feels really critical, I actually don't mind if you interrupt me or raise your hand or something like that. I usually keep an eye on the chat as well. So that's okay. If you need to get some information before I move on, I certainly welcome that as well. All right. So I'm going to start from maybe the most important place. What is recovery? And I think there's two important definitions. One is from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration. And it really talks about that being a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. What I found interesting is that CCAR, which is the recovery coach kind of model, it's Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery. Their definition is that you're in recovery when you say you are. You're in recovery when you say you are. And that's going to be important for the frameworks that we are going to get into, because I think sometimes we try to layer on ideas of what recovery is in terms of external assessments of individuals. Are they using or not? How much are they using? What is their housing? What is their, other relationships look like? all of these things. What is their behavior? And CCAR really takes the approach of like, you get to decide for yourself, fully self-directed, when you are in recovery and when you're not. You get to define that for yourself. And that's really important. And I really like this image below because I think both for recovery coaches, peer supporters, as well as treatment programs, there can be this idea that someone's struggling, they come into this space or relationship or treatment, and then they have an upward trajectory towards wellness or feeling better or resolving those conditions or circumstances that brought them through the door. And what is true, though, is that it is a really complex, ever weaving and flowing backwards and forwards, ups and downs kind of process. And so how do we stay connected as peer supporters, as treatment programs to folks through that process? One of the things that can happen is that we can revert to like punishment and consequences and things like that can really disconnect us from people. And so that's something to consider as well for us. So what is a recovery coach, right? So part of what we're doing is kind of thinking about this within the substance use community. But so a peer recovery coach, it might be a term that is most often used, are people who self-identify as being in recovery from substance use and can share openly about their recovery journey with the teams and people receiving services. And some organizations may actually hire people that they call peer recovery coaches, but that is, they don't have a personal lived experience. They may be allies or family members. And so it's important for organizations, as well as I think recovery coaches, to make sure that they're being really transparent with folks about what their experience is. So traditionally speaking, a peer recovery coach would be someone with personal lived experience. And so a recovery coach without that peer element might be an ally or family member. So making that distinction is important, but also what's most important is that organizations and recovery coaches, whatever their lived experience is that it's really transparent with folks. What training might they have? So we're going to talk a little bit about the Recovery Coach Academy, which is through CCAR, as well as some organizations are dually training folks in intentional peer support. And I'll talk a little bit about that model as well. Both models involve in-person or online trainings from 5 to 8 days, depending on what the format is. Maine's intentional peer support training is 12 days because it's when it's online, for example. And both of these frameworks kind of explore what is support look like, how do we navigate boundaries with each other, where does self-disclosure come in, and how does that look? And connecting folks to the communities of choice, healing communities or whatever kind of supports they're looking for in the community is a part of both of those roles as well. I really like this quote here that says, "We meet each other not as broken individuals, but as whole people evolving together." I think that really helps shift our mindset into what we're doing with folks. I think even in times that I felt broken and struggle, when someone met me as a whole person, that was so valuable to building a relationship with them and to actually being fully present and seeing the wisdom and experience and strengths that I brought to the table when it was really hard for me at that time. So really, really resonated with that quote. So when we look at the two trainings that I was talking about, we have recovery coach. And so that is primarily focused on substance use. That's kind of the framework that it works in. And whereas intentional peer support focus broadly on what we might call mental health, including substance use. And so there's a variety of folks, including myself, who've been trained and are trainers in that have substance use as part of their experience, but it doesn't look at it things through like sort of a diagnostic lens. It looks at more as like, what did you experience? What did you struggle with? And the sort of breadth of those experiences. Within recovery coaching, the primary goal is to connect folks to resources and remove barriers. And the primary for IPS, intentional peer support, is to develop a mutually supportive relationship, as well as maybe connect to sort of broader community. Requirements for these trainings, as I mentioned, first, recovery coaching, you can be a person in recovery, a friend, or an ally. In intentional peer support, you must have a lived experience of struggling with mental health, which may include substance use. There is a state certification for recovery coaching that's held by the Portland Recovery Community Center, whereas within intentional peer support, it's held at the state, and it's been there for a long time. The training hours you can see there, there's additional continuing educations. For authorized trainers, I mean, the two primary nowadays for recovery coaching are the Portland Recovery Community Center and Healthy Acadia as sort of the state-funded, kind of programs that offer this. You may find other trainings offered by other folks. Certainly, if you go to, with the terms of the cost, within Maine, those are free. But if you go to CCAR specifically, you'd be paying, a few $100s potentially. So in Maine, it's free though. And same for intentional peer support, it's free. And the trainers there are state trainers, so they're contracted trainers by the state directly. Where are these roles? I think, folks are aware of substance use focused kind of recovery centers or recovery community organizations, opioid health homes, medication assisted treatment, substance use treatment programs in behavioral health clinics, emergency departments. Also, there's recovery courts, alternative courts, have a variety of names, but the court systems as well have recovery coaches as part of those. And with intentional peer support, you have mental health focused kind of peer support centers, behavioral health homes, ACT teams, again, emergency rooms, peer support line, Riverview, the psychiatric facility, which is also Dorothea Dix in the Bangor area, has them as well, and some other small state-funded programs. So there's been really a growth in these. And so within recovery coaching, which is sort of maybe quote unquote a little bit newer, there's growing paid positions and paid internships for those roles. And so if you're working within a clinic, it definitely should be paid, but you may find some folks who are practicing recovery coaching on a volunteer basis. And whereas intentional peer support is really primarily paid, we see those across a variety of organizations and nonprofits. So it just kind of gives you a look at the two programs. So in addition to those foundational trainings, folks may find, I think we've seen in my experience, a lot of value in accessing additional kind of supplemental trainings. And so the alternatives to suicide is about how we have conversations when folks are struggling with thoughts of suicide. We're hearing voices when folks have those experiences. Those can really open up, create sort of more skilled peer supporters to navigate those conversations that might be feel a little scary or unknown to us if you don't have those experiences. And the state offers some of that for free. Nonviolent communication is another really aligned way of communicating, training that offers a lot to folks. We found, and I found personally, being exposed to different, cultural cultural humility, cultural respect, kind of things like around decolonization. For example, by Wabanaki Reach was a really valuable training to understand the folks in the Native community and what they were navigating sort of culturally, historically in the state of Maine. What's been really important too is creating spaces. Folks talk about grief and loss when we're in support roles and trying to build community and support folks. Sometimes, whether it's overdose, accidents, or other things, we lose folks. And so creating space to kind of process that together is really important. Understanding vicarious trauma, harm reduction, and also creating opportunities, professional development is really important. And so when we think about traditional help, right, I really love images like this because it kind of simplifies it. Me as the recovery coach or peer supporter, in traditional helping roles, I would, it'd be one directional. I'm the provider, I'm here to support you. Particularly within intentional peer support, it really creates a framework that actually it's, if our intention is to build a mutually supportive relationship, then we both need to be focused on the relationship. It's not just about you. So that means we're having conversations about how the relationship is going, how things are going. We have both actually have a shared responsibility to caretake that relationship. And I think even though this is a framework rooted in intentional peer support, I think it can be important also for recovery coaches to have some awareness of like, how can you create relationships where we both have a responsibility for mutual respect, mutual consideration, talk about how things are going. So if I'm a recovery coach and I just like jump into problem solving and I'm telling you what to do and you should do this, which isn't in alignment with that model, what does it mean for you to say, hey, Randy, like, hold on, I'm not feeling heard right now. This is not what I'm looking for right now. Can we talk about it? That's a big risk for someone to say that, particularly if you're in a treatment program. And likewise, if the person I'm supporting as a recovery coach starts telling me to F off and or calling me names or being like you're useless and worthless, how do I have a conversation with them to say, hey, I know you're going through a lot. I don't want to, this doesn't work for me, right? How can we have a relationship where we're communicating, where there is respect for both of us, that we're listening to each other and we're not defaulting into some of these kinds of things that are, corrosive. So having that kind of framework or that image and thinking about that shared responsibility, I think can be really valuable. Certainly, as we think about peer support relationships, they're really key to recovery in many ways. So we create connections, and that can create senses of belonging, to know that we're in this together, to feel less alone. We build trust at the pace of our relationship, or the pace of trust that can grow in the relationship, to try new things, to try on new ways of being, to explore new opportunities and resources and activities. That's not just about accessing treatment or going to a support group or a recovery meeting. Maybe it's about going fishing or checking out a new trail or trying a new hobby, or really looking holistically at people's experiences. A lot of times when I worked in a shelter, it wasn't about us sitting down in an office talking. It was like, hey, let's go to the walk at the beach and talk about life. Let's go to a different space and think about what we want to create in our world. And that's that visioning for a life worth living. And that's not just about accessing medication or certain modalities of treatment. It's really about a broader conversation and how we can kind of shift and unpack some of the fear, judgment, maybe internalized stigma that we have, and start to think more towards what's possible in our lives. And starting to consider some of the ways that we've learned to be in past relationships, and maybe there are opportunities to, again, shift that in our own, but also sort of more broadly. Many folks, as navigating recovery means like maybe developing new relationships, moving away from others that aren't serving us or not, at the moment. That's a really challenging process. And so being able to support folks physically, like through that accompaniment, can be really valuable, as well as those conversations. As we try to build sort of more of a community where support is really readily available and accessible, and it's not dependent on services or coaches, right? What is it to build a community that's not dependent on these things, right? That's really an important part of the conversation. Part of what, we talked a lot about in the spaces that I was in is like, I don't want to be someone's sole support, their sole phone call, right? So how can we have conversations early on about broadening that? And that's just not sustainable. I'm not going to be anywhere forever. So what does it mean to really create sustainable recovery? And so the type of support that might be offered is that emotional support I talked about: empathy, compassion, understanding, curiosity, informational support. So that's sharing information about resources and services and where community supports are and how to access them and what you might expect. Many people on medication, for example, like understanding that you may hear someone in a 12-step meeting talk about medication is bad, like you're still on drugs, you're not in recovery if you're on medication. Or they might hear, if they're on mental health medications, like that's an outside issue, or something like that. You're going to hear different things. And so being able to talk about, hey, this is what you might hear, but there's other people with other perspectives that are in other welcoming kind of perspectives, or these are the groups where folks are really open-minded to these different things. And so helping people navigate the recovery community, which has diverse opinions, as anywhere. That tangible support I mentioned is like that physical accompaniment. So we might go with someone to their first appointment because it feels overwhelming or feels too much. Or we might go to that support group meeting together for the first time as they kind of get their feet wet in it. And that can be really helpful. We may, as I said, go to a new park or check out a food bank or go to an apartment viewing together. Depends, right? But that's negotiated within the relationship. And as always, kind of supporting building relationships and social connection. One of the key factors, and this is another quote that resonated with me, is that, what's really key in peer support, and I think is challenging when you care about folks or folks are struggling, or if you're losing folks, to overdose or incarceration or other things, we can really slip into a rescuing of folks and really carrying more responsibility for them than is warranted. And so really thinking about support isn't about rescuing people or saving people. It's really about walking side by side with each other. And that framework, as I was mentioning before, that like in that walking side by side, like we offer each other wisdom. I'm not here with all the answers. I don't know what's right for you. I don't have, the solution or the perfect equation or formula for recovery for you. But we can talk about what that might be from your perspective or what you might want to try. All right. So now I'm going to shift into the tangible nitty-gritty of multidisciplinary team integration. So one of the things that I think is important for folks on multidisciplinary team is to have like a collective understanding of like the differences in that the folks that walk into our space as peer supporters are often walking in with a badge that's like, I'm the person, literally, I'm the person in recovery. I'm the person who, there may be a case manager, a psychiatrist or other who has lived experience, who struggled with substances and also in recovery, but it's not on their badge, right? It's not that's not their role, and that's not showing up in a sort of visible outed way that recovery coaches are and peer supporters are. So like kind of honoring that, not as like, oh, you poor thing, but just out of more as like respect, or like acknowledgement of like, okay, like, because what can happen sometimes when there isn't like sort of acknowledgement of that reality is that folks have started to like pick apart, like, ooh, are they using again? Or, oh, that behavior, are they hearing voices again? Or, oh, like they start to, oh, what diagnosis I wonder they have, there can be that curiosity that's kind of corrosive. So being really mindful that they're walking in a different way, then you have a level of protection that they don't, and around, or a level of choice that they don't. So acknowledging that, I think, is just important in balance. Another core piece of peer support, and this is affirmed by CIPSS as well as all of the trainings related to peer support, is that engagement with peer support is voluntary 100% of the time. It can never be required in programs or in treatment. Obviously, if you don't require something, that means that people have a choice. And some people may choose not to engage with peer support. But there might be ways you can structure the peer support person into the intake process, into some groups, into other spaces, so folks get a sense at least of who they are, or at least have an initial meeting with the peer support so they can make an informed choice, learn about what the peer support's about, and then decide whether they want to participate. But it's really important that it's never required. It's really variable what these roles look like, and so it really depends on the relationship. And so some folks might be just looking for some texting back and forth and kinds of check-ins. Some people looking for phone calls. Some people looking for meeting in person. Some people looking for all those things. So that's really negotiated in the relationship in a way that will work for everybody. Which might mean that that's weekly check-ins and meetings, bi-weekly, sporadic. It really depends. I mean, there are folks I met with at first a couple times a week, and then it was once a week, and then it was bi-weekly, and then it was just kind of a text or quick phone call here and there, right? Kind of organically, naturally kind of subsided. And so often one of the first questions we get is like, what's a caseload, in terms of like kind of common language in the field and of treatment. And so that actually is very variable as well. It depends on the nature of those relationships and what's going on for the moment. But identifying some targets of like, if someone's doing a lot of in-person visits, I mean, could they really see more than 4 people a day? They're working 40 hours a week. That's like 20 people, so 25 people. I don't know, figuring out what makes sense, but checking in with the recovery coach of like, what's that balance looking like? Which is different than other roles like case management, who might have like, you have 27 cases and that's your thing. So this is different. This should be different in peer support if we want to support fidelity. And there's probably needs to be some education, because certainly resentment can build about why is, Randy only seeing 15 people and I have to see 27. So making sure there's clear communication about the differences in the roles and responsibilities, and kind of neutralizing, for lack of a better word, any kind of tension that builds. And I'll get more into that later. Allowing that flexibility allows us to adapt to what's needed in relationships and in recovery coaching, not what's kind of prescribed, which is really important. So when we think about supervision, CIPSS, as well as, general consensus is best practice is that every recovery coach or peer supporter is supervised by a peer support supervisor. So that's someone trained in the peer support model, has hopefully lived or living experience, hopefully experience practicing peer support themselves, are kind of the three top elements. And then having some awareness that, within recovery coaching, intentional peer support, as well as others, it sort of looks at stigma, labels, cultural respect, all of these things, which is essentially an anti-oppressive philosophy, that we're not our biases aren't coming in to these relationships in really harmful ways. So having some awareness of those things can be really important as well. But having been trained in the model, when I started in peer support, my supervisor was not. And so they had a really hard time challenging me about, like, Randy, help me understand how what you're doing in this relationship fits with this model. Because I'm seeing, they just didn't know. So they couldn't really challenge that or have me articulate it, which would have been really useful for me to do some self-reflection at times. So having that person trained is really important, but that doesn't mean that if there's a clinical program manager that's overseeing the whole multidisciplinary team, that they have a critical role. They are not kind of hands off. It's really a partnership with the peer support supervisor to make sure, and that might mean that you have meetings together on a basis. So where it's a peer support supervisor, the clinical program manager, and the peer support staff meet as a group is really critical to integration. How are we communicating? How are referrals happening? Where are we introducing the peer support? How are those connections doing? How is the team communicating with you around, discharges and these types of things? We used to have all the time clients were discharged and the peer was never notified. And so they were like, wait, I can't see them anymore. And that's not patient-centered. That's not anything centered. Maybe chaos-centered. I'll give you that. So making sure that we're having those conversations is really important in a structured, systematic way can be really, really important. And that the supervisor really has the skills and awareness to build collaborative relationships with people across differences and different roles. So that's a little bit of the supervision structure, and that might be that there's peer support supervision once a week, and then there's that group supervision bi-weekly or once a month, those types of things. So figuring out what your structure is that might shift over time is really important. But having someone that's an expert in the program in peer support will be really valuable. And the next piece is really thinking about, I tend to only be lightly dramatic, and so I wanted to say that redesigning the team meetings is almost always needed. But in reality, I think I found that it really is always needed. It needs to be examined because across all peer support models, the peer supporter leaves for clinical discussions about individuals. And this is very different than everyone else's role. So the nurse, psychiatrist, prescriber, whoever it may be, case managers and other folks, other roles on the team may all be talking about individuals when that individual is not there because they're running down the different plans or sharing test results and those types of things. The peer supporter leaves those discussions. They do not have a clinical function. That's not their role. And really, we want them to focus on their relationship with the people receiving services, and that what they learn about the person comes from the patient directly or the client directly. And so we're not reading people's charts. We're not reading their diagnosis. We're not looking at their test results. We're not doing any of those things. We're allowing people to share with us what they want to share with us as we build trust in the relationship, and we'll do the same. And so they leave during these conversations. And so this has the added challenge of why peer supporters weren't informed that they were discharged. People were being discharged because they weren't in the meetings when they were saying, oh, here's why we're discharging them, and da 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 da. So figuring out strategies to make sure that communication functions with a structure like this is really important. And so that doesn't mean that they're not present at the team meetings. They'll be present and hopefully have space on the agenda to talk about, hey, because they can talk about logistical stuff, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But who are you connected with? Who you haven't been able to connect with? Who's coming into the program? Who's going out of the program? Oh, Jimmy's coming in tomorrow for an intake. Randy, can you stop by and introduce yourself? These are all okay discussions. What we don't talk about is that Jimmy has, struggled with, heroin and is in a domestic violence relationship and, has tested for these different drugs. And we did a score assessment on this, and this was a score. Those are things that are not part of our roles. And it's not that we can't have that information or it's like a violation of confidentiality or something or HIPAA. It's none of those. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what's appropriate information or needed information for my work, and more so what's information that's going to skew the way that I see Jimmy in a way that's not going to be helpful to the relationship. But I want Jimmy to say, and no, like, you get to tell me what you want to talk, and we talk about what we want to talk about here. I'm never coming in with an agenda. And so a big part of that framework too is nothing about us without us, which is a framework that says that people who are receiving services should be at the center of every conversation about them. And so it's really, there's definitely different models like open dialogue and shared decision-making, other things like that, that really brought in that perspective. So spending some time on team building, given that they're going to be communicating in different ways, not joining team meetings for clinical discussion, not kind of having back and forth relationships with different elements of the team about people. That means that we have to make space for other ways to build team. And so, being able to check in about how the collaboration is feeling for us, talking through any communication challenges, team retreats, luncheons with each other, where we learn about each other's programs. Or roles, excuse me, can be really helpful. Or just checking in of anything that's kind of going on in life or work, that sort of thing, can be really important ways to build team and collaboration. And these are just some examples of what questions we might ask to kind of support team building. And so they can be life-centered or they can be work-centered, right? So if we want the peer support's perspective on how to integrate harm reduction into conversations, we don't need to talk about Jimmy's harm reduction in terms of what Jimmy's going through, but we can say, how are we as a team incorporating ideas and concepts of harm reduction? What is harm reduction philosophy? What is our collective harm reduction philosophy as a team? What does that look like? What do the conversations look like? What do we say? Similar with self-harming, if we think that that's an element of someone's experience, whatever it may be, we can talk about if we think someone's diverting medication, or explore, like, what do we do in those circumstances? What's our philosophy? What is our conversations? Those types of things can be really create cohesion in the team, but also clarity about the team's approach. And so when the peer supporter might hear about someone diverting medication or selling medication for whatever reason, they can have that kind of shared knowledge and share with the individual, like, hey, this is our team's philosophy on this. This is what you might expect if you share this with the prescriber, and this kind of thing. So it helps with team building and helps improve quality as well. And also, like, creating spaces for specific trainings can be really valuable for the team to learn about peer support, to ask questions like, why isn't the peer supporter here? Why is the recovery coach not telling me these things? Are they keeping secrets? Are they, like, whatever it may be? Or I'm mad that the recovery coach only has to work with 15 people and I'm working with 27, or they don't have to do paperwork the same way I did. We can kind of talk about those things and create opportunities for folks to address any kind of misconceptions or lack of clarity. And this can be like allocating time in team meetings. I think it's been really valuable to provide like documents that clearly outline role functions. I mean, I think if any of us have seen an engagement survey, like, the top issue is people's clarity about their role. And so that goes to as well as clarity about other people's role. So having documents that kind of outline those functions. So, and within recovery coaching, it's kind of gray. So I can give rides depending on organizational policy, but let's say I can give rides, but that doesn't mean I'm a ride giver or that I'm a taxi or that a case manager saying, oh, Jimmy has an appointment at 3, can you give him a ride? Jimmy has to ask me that, right? And Jimmy and I have to negotiate that. So figuring out how those conversations around transportation, around these different things is navigated is really important. I think too, like having, and I've kind of alluded to this, what, for lack of a better term, kind of thematic discussions, where we can de-identify a situation, or we can look at a theme that's been coming up in teams that's been a challenge, and talk about it as a group. Like, again, what's your approach to this? What's your philosophy around that? How do we have uncomfortable conversations with folks that we're worried about? Not in a way that's going to deteriorate or harm the relationship, but like, how do we have some of those things? And I think having conversations that set up the framework that we're going to make mistakes with each other. We're going to share too much, share too little, not share at all. We're going to make mistakes. Like, this is part of integration. This is part of like how teams operate as we're trying to figure it all out. And so I think sometimes I've heard from sort of case managers and other clinical folks like, well, I didn't know what to share, so I didn't share anything at all. And so they didn't share that the person has violence in their home and you shouldn't meet them there or something like that. It could get extreme. So I didn't share anything at all. And we've heard on the peer side, like, well, I didn't think I could even share with them who I was seeing, right? They've taken an extreme view of not sharing information. And so it's like, no, that's okay. Logistical information is okay. And so making sure that we're on the same page and being able to like make mistakes. I've also heard peers like really worried and on both sides, or within the teams, like really scared they're going to overstep or make a mistake, and so they don't do anything at all. And that can be fairly paralyzing, and then it's deteriorating and not supportive of teams. Or what I mean is supporting of the folks utilizing our services. So being able to create the normalizing, like, this is going to be a little wonky. We're going to make mistakes. It's not about blame, judgment, and shame. It's really about figuring it out and talking about it. And how do we have those kind of uncomfortable conversations with each other around that? What do we need to have those conversations? Can be really important. Another piece is the documentation, right? So within peer support roles, we're not reporting back to the team the details of our conversations in team meetings. We're not part of clinical discussions. We're not disclosing things that Jimmy told me, the last time we met, unless Jimmy there's some reason that's Jimmy is fully aware of, that Jimmy can't do himself, those types of things. And so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to say, hey, Jimmy, like, our conversations are really private. It's really just about us to focus on recovery and exploring community and talking about relationships, whatever. I'm not going to, be sharing or detailing my conversations with you back to the team and then go in documentation and detail those things. So in documentation, it's really important that it is consistent with the model that's being used. And so we can, Main Care has approved these notes. And so we might say, like, they're related to the model of the work we're doing. And so, like, we introduced ourselves to one another. We're building on our connection. We're starting to, explore barriers to recovery. We're talking about, a future meeting. We're validating one another's experiences. We're talking about whatever models, principles, tasks, and ethics. We're introducing them to the framework. We're exploring some recent challenges and supporting each other through those. These are all things that give enough information to say, like, what we're kind of focused on without providing details that would compromise the relationship and the trust and the framework and fidelity of the model. So making sure that documentation is aligned is really valuable, as well as I mentioned, I'll reemphasize that the recovery coach is not in the notes reading their clinical notes from other people is really important. So clarity around documentation is really important. That includes like letting folks know what the documentation would be. So when I met, I guess Jimmy is my popular name now, but when I meet with Jimmy, like I'm saying, hey, Jimmy, so as part of this program, I do notes. That's how they account for my time. Here's the type of notes that I write. Here's some examples. What do you think of that? Does that work for you? Any concerns, questions about that? Is this something you want to participate in, or do you want me just to kind of, because it's going to be very broad. It's going to say, oh, we talked about some recent challenges and how to move forward. Like, do you want to know that, or what role do you want to have in this? Because if Jimmy's like, I want to see everything you write about me because maybe they've had trust broken in the past, or there's other reasons why they're really concerned, we want to make sure that we're honoring that and there's clarity for Jimmy around what we're doing. They may want us to put something in the note for them. And so in that case, we'd say, Jimmy wants to share this. And those types of things. So we can take a collaborative approach to it. My personal experience is I tell people what the notes are. I might even show them the list of, because we had created what's called like a smart phrase where you just click one of them. So I would show them and they would just be like, oh yeah, okay, I don't care. Thanks for showing me out. I'm good. I don't need to, we don't need to worry about it. I don't need to see it. Other folks, again, who maybe have had stuff in their records like, I'm sure you all know stories about folks who went to the emergency room and had, substance use on their chart. And then all of a sudden they, were being criticized or stigmatized or not given pain medications for something really serious. Or, I've had friends who have ended up in the psych unit because they had a diagnosis in their chart and they didn't realize like, oh, they just thought it was psych related and not actually like an ulcer or a pain or something. So, there are people who have had various experiences in healthcare settings that have impacted their ability to trust and be open. So we want to make sure that we're really transparent with folks here as well. And that might mean that if someone shares information with me that slips or I overhear it, I have to consider, being transparent with Jimmy. It's like, hey, I did hear that you had, something come up on your UA. I want to be transparent with you about that I did overhear that, but it's not something we have to talk about. Like, it's not something that, you have to explain to me. I just wanted to be transparent with you that that's information I did hear. And if you do want to talk about it, certainly it's an open door, but yeah, we'll see where they want to go. So figuring out that level of transparency too is important. So just some general things to consider in terms of sharing information, like peer supporters don't join those team meetings for discussions about people where it's detailed clinical information or test results and those types of things. It's really logistical information, who you seeing, where you seeing them, how often, who you're struggling to get connected with, who you haven't heard from. Certainly if there is, as I mentioned, like a physical safety concern, that's really important for folks to know. So that's something that would be okay to share. Appointments are typically made between the two people, the peer supporter and the person receiving the service or the treatment program. That's not done by administrative assistant or the person calling the office or those types of things. They figure it out together. That kind of informalizes that process and supports the relationship. I mean, we want to have as close to an organic relationship as possible. But we may have business cards that we give to folks and like maybe the intake or something like that. The person, if I can't be there, offers my business card. But it's most important that the peer support reaches out to the individual. And so we might just get an intaker to a program might say, hey, is it okay if the peer supporter gives you a call? They want to explain the peer support role and then decide, just give you some information about it. And if the person says yes, then the peer supporter might give them a call. Would give them a call if they can't be there in person. So again, kind of thinking about like, how do people come into our program and where can the peer support be interjected to make that introduction is really important to consider. As I mentioned, peer supporters will document in the electronic health record, but the way that they document is more limited. They do not document detailed information. As I mentioned, transportation, just to, we don't generally give rides just for the sole purpose of giving rides. Like, oh, you need a ride, so let me give it to you. It has to be within the framework of, and the relationship. So maybe the person's really anxious about something, or it's their first time they've been to this location, those sorts of things. And that needs to really be originating from the relationship, not from the team. And so we've seen teams be like, hey, Randy, like, I need you to go give this person a ride to this thing. That's not how that works. Because that's a slippery slope. Rides are a slippery slope as it is. But it really needs to come from Jimmy to say like, hey, this is what's going on for me. I'm wondering if you could help me out with this. Like, what do you think? And we'll negotiate that together. So having clarity on the team about how that process happens. I mean, we've had folks say to a peer supporter, hey, this person really needs to go do their dishes. Can you go stand next to them while they do their dishes? That's not really how that would work. So some of the challenges we might experience. So most people that are entering into peer support recovery coaching haven't been trained yet. And so, what that requires sort of more of a support. And that's why it's having a peer support supervisor is so valuable. Help orient them to services. It's different when you're, as a receiver of services, and then I'm shifting into being on the team of services. That's a different animal. So being able to help orient to like how things work, what is communication, like what is professionalism in this space look like, those types of things is really valuable. Orientating to that. Really having clearly defined roles for the program manager as well as the peer support supervisor. This is one of the things that's definitely gotten in the way. And so making sure that there's clarity there. Acknowledging like holding stories and what I mean by that is like that we hear people's kind of experiences, trauma, abuse, substance, we hear stories like, other people on the team, but like maybe sometimes in a more detailed way or a different way. And so as everyone should have support and empathy and like navigating those emotions of hearing really raw and hard stories, this is true for the peer support role as well. Debunking the role model of recovery. So sometimes when a peer supporter comes in, there can be like, oh, you're the role model of recovery. Like you're the epitome, the pedestal, like this is what recovery should look like. And that can have the effect of really silencing us to like not be able to say like I'm having a really hard time or I'm struggling or because I need to be the best, I need to be the perfect example of recovery. And so this idea of role modeling recovery, what we should be role modeling is sort of openness, transparency, honesty, and the realness of recovery that sometimes is just really fucking hard to get through the day. This is not linear. This is not perfect. And so, making sure that we're creating that space for folks. And I think this is true for anyone on the team, really, but this really comes up around recovery where we hear language like recovery rock stars and these types of things, and just wondering about the sort of impact that can have on folks can be really, really harmful. And the other end of that is treating them as fragile, right? So the other end of that spectrum is like, we don't want to be like, recovery rock star, you're amazing, you're everything. And we also want to be like, oh my God, you fragile little thing. You've been through so much. It must be so hard for you, right? Like we don't want to be on either end of those kind of things. So being really mindful of like how we find like they're an employee, they're figuring it out, it's balanced, there's a lot to hold for all of us. Balancing schedules can be really hard. Figuring out how to support engagement and structuring the position is really hard. And then I've had folks in multiple different offices because they were split between different teams. That's really hard to balance. So making sure that we're figuring out and have clarity around our priorities is really important. And finally, thinking about it collectively as a team, there's nothing more sort of disheartening. I can't think of the other word that begins with D right now. But like how is our team, what language is our team using about people, right? I mean, there's nothing worse than me walking into a lunchroom and hear people disparaging clients because they're feeling frustrated. Frustration is a part of the game, and like I'm not saying it's not, but how we manage that and talk about that frustration that comes up for us, or that, whatever, is really important. And making sure, are we using recovery kind of centered language? Are we destigmatizing our own office? Is really a place to start. If we want to integrate peer support and people with lived experience into spaces, is our space really creating and sort of epitomizing what patient-centered means, what recovery-oriented means, and taking a look at that is really important. And if we need outlets to vent about certain situations, how are we doing that? That's healthy and like supportive and not sort of undermining why we're all here, which is to support folks and provide quality care. And I will leave it at that. Any questions, reactions? Reflections, experiences?
Hi, Randy.
Hey.
I in my clinical role, kind of overseeing like peer support and partnering with our peers and our program, think a lot about the value that they get from the co-reflections and continuing educations. But I sometimes feel like I fall short because I don't get that same wonderful education, and I'm wondering about access to those things because they come back with these really great ideas that then I'm like, wow, I need to find like this. But I think about how valuable it might be for me to sit in on that nonviolent communication training, maybe not joining them, but having access to it. And so just wondering if if there's thoughts or additional resources for us who are supporting peers to better understand, like not just initially, but like on an ongoing, because I think that there's a really great support for the peers, but then I think that sometimes there's a disconnect when, I'm like, okay, I've gone to peer one out, like the peer 101. I'm doing these
Totally.
as a leader to try and better understand. I meet with them regularly. I talk to them. I have them make decisions about our program. But then, like, I feel like they know more things are coming out and advancing, and then I feel kind of left behind and inept in like carrying that information and making sure that I'm being a part of it, if that makes sense.
Totally. So we are doing like twice a year. It starts next week. We have a intentional peer support managers training that kind of goes, it's really good for folks that maybe even haven't had managers who are from a clinical perspective. It's a mixed group. So keeping an eye out for the IPS managers training is really good. And if you send me, I'll put my email in. If you send me an email, I can make sure that you kind of get on the notice for that. I think too, there is like a co-reflection for supervisors. And so asking them if you are able to go to that space as a non-CIPSS kind of trained person, I think would be good. And who you can ask is the second email I put in the chat, which is the CIPSS inbox, and say, hey, I know that there's a co-reflection for supervisors. Is this something I can go to? And that's sort of quarterly as well. Yeah. Sweetser has a peer training network, and they offer the nonviolent communication as well as some other stuff. And they would be great folks to check out if you could go to those spaces. And I will give you another email to
Thank you so much.
talk to them. And I think they usually have some space available. So I think Elena is the director over there at Sweetser and oversees the peer training network. So reach out to her and yeah, so really valuable, really worthwhile. I appreciate the question. Yeah, hopefully there's some options.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Randy, as always, for sharing. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hope everybody stays safe and warm in the snow. And we'll hope to see you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.